Thank you all for coming. We have a very, I think, a very interesting and timely discussion today. I'm going to introduce the author of our report, who is Nicole Mader, who is a senior research fellow at the center and also a PhD candidate in the Milano School. Nicole, come on up.
Thank you, Clara, and thanks to all of you for joining us indoors on this beautiful spring morning, even though it means you will be spending the next 2 hours indoors. I would also like to offer a heartfelt thanks to my colleagues who helped put this report and event together. It has truly been a team effort, and I couldn't have done it without each and every one of you. I'm going to walk you through our main findings, which are based on newly available data from the New York City Department of Education, showing where each kindergarten student was zoned for elementary school over the last 10 years. Our analysis reveals that a surprising amount of families opt out of their zoned elementary schools, that this decision to opt out is subscribed by race, class, and language status, and that this has alarming implications for our public school system as a whole. I think the number of people here today is a testament to how polarizing this issue of school choice can be. It's only become more so since the appointment of Education Secretary Betsy DeVos, an ardent supporter of choice. Although we do not have a system of vouchers for private schools here in New York City, we have long had one of the most friendly policy environments for public school choice in the country. Mayor Bloomberg's expansions of school choice are most well known, especially citywide high school choice. But choice options at all grade levels have existed for even longer. East Harlem's District 4 became a national example of choice after Debbie Meyer founded Central Park East in 1974. Progressive unzoned schools, magnet schools, and bilingual schools thrived during this era. District 1 disbanded its zones in the 1990s to become the city's first all-choice district at the elementary level, and then charters quickly took root after they were authorized in New York State in 1998. Over the last 10 years, the number of public elementary schools where some or all of the seats are unzoned has more than doubled. District 7 in the South Bronx and 23 in Central Brooklyn joined District 1 as choice districts. The charter sector has more than tripled over the last 10 years. All of these options have allowed more and more families to leave their zone schools, where they were assigned by address, and enroll their children in other public schools that they prefer instead. With this growth in choice options and the advent of a centralized kindergarten application system in 2013, the share of public school kindergarten students who exercise school choice has grown significantly over the past 10 years. In 2007-08 school year, 28% of all kindergarten students chose a public school. By last year, this number had grown to 40%. This means that 27,000 kindergarten students leave their zone every morning to attend a different public elementary school. Even if we exclude the 4% of students who live in the choice districts, fully 36% of students are opting out of their assigned zones to go to schools of choice or other zone schools where there are available seats. This proportion varies widely when we look at students of each race or ethnicity. This graph shows how students in all race or ethnicity groups choose more now than they did 10 years ago. But Black students choose far more often than any other group, at nearly 60% last year. About 9% of Black students live in choice districts, but even when we take those away, still more than half of all Black students opt out of their zone schools. Hispanic students choose at about the average rate of all students, and white and Asian students are far less likely to choose. These differences may reflect higher satisfaction among white and Asian families with their zone schools, and a dissatisfaction among Black and Hispanic families with their zone schools. There are also large differences in choice by socioeconomic status and English language proficiency. To untangle these characteristics from race and ethnicity, we conducted a logistic regression that controlled for race and a few other student characteristics. We found that students who are free lunch eligible, meaning their families are in poverty, are 80% less likely to opt out of their zone schools than students who are non-free lunch eligible. And English language learners are 73% less likely to opt out than non-English language learners. This is in line with a significant body of research that has identified the many barriers to choice for low-income and immigrant families. Researching your many school options, filling out the applications in time, and commuting further with your child each day are just a few of the added burdens that school choice researchers have documented, and I'm sure many parents in the room can attest to. Of course, some families experiencing poverty or with limited English proficiency are able to overcome the barriers and exercise choice, but they are doubly disadvantaged in this so-called choice marketplace. Black students are much more likely to leave their zone schools for a charter school than any other group of students. In fact, 1/3 of all Black kindergarten students in the city attend a charter school, up from only 8% 10 years ago. Also, a much higher proportion of Black students choose to attend a different zone school, not the one they were assigned to, than any other group, about 14% last year. White and Asian students are far less likely to attend a charter school, but they are more likely to attend a school with a gifted and talented program. This is no surprise, given the extensive research on how the gifted and talented test, taken when students are only 4 years old, is a clear barrier by race and class to this type of school. We see here that free lunch eligible students are more inclined to charters than English language learners. In fact, hardly any English language learners at all attended charter schools prior to 2012-13. Dual language schools with instruction in 2 languages are more popular with English language learners than any other group. To understand how school demographics and performance might be driving family school choices, we looked at the student bodies and the standardized test scores of the older students at each school before our kindergarten students made their choices for the 2016-17 school year. We found that students who opted out of their zones were typically assigned to schools with lower test scores, higher shares of Black and Hispanic students, and higher shares of free lunch eligible students. The schools they chose instead typically had higher test scores and fewer free lunch eligible students. And although Black and Hispanic choosers went to schools with almost exactly the same proportions of Black and Hispanic students, white and Asian students typically went to schools with far fewer Black and Hispanic students than the schools to which they were zoned. These factors are all so highly correlated that it's hard to tell whether test scores are driving families' school choices because they are seen as a measure of school quality, or whether they are being used as an ostensibly race-neutral signal to some parents that the racial and socioeconomic backgrounds of the students at a school will match their own. Of course, these patterns all play out differently across our large and diverse city. The most relevant boundaries for school choice are the 32 community school districts that were created 50 years ago. Students who live in each district have priority for admission to schools in that district over students who live outside the district. So most choosers stay within their districts. Here we see the districts with the highest proportions of students who stay inside their zone in gray, followed by the share of students who chose other schools in the district in orange, out of the district in yellow, and charter schools in blue. Districts in Queens and Staten Island have the fewest students leaving their zones. Districts 20 and 21 in Bay Ridge and Sheepshead Bay, Brooklyn also have quite high zone retention. This may reflect the lower density of these neighborhoods, a higher satisfaction with the local schools, or a more limited presence of charter schools. District 10, serving the Kingbridge and Fordham neighborhood in the Bronx, has the distinction of being the only district in the city where more students attend their kindergartens than they did 10 years ago. These are the districts with the lowest zone retention rates. Districts 1, 7, and 23 stand out at the bottom because those are our choice districts. They don't have zones. But they still have a lot of variation between the 3 of them. Only 44% of students who live in District 23 in Brownsville, Brooklyn, attend the traditional public schools there. Only District 16 in Bed-Stuy and District 5 in Harlem hold on to fewer shares of their students. And several of the districts on this list send over 1/3 of their students to charter schools. What many of these districts have in common is dramatic gentrification over the last decade. In fact, we found that 60% of all students living in gentrifying neighborhoods exercise school choice. Even when controlling for all other factors, these students were 1.7 times more likely to opt out of their zone schools than students living in higher income or non-gentrifying, typically lower income neighborhoods. This is true for all race or ethnicity groups, but white parents seem to be particularly inclined to opt out of a zone school when they live in a gentrifying neighborhood. Almost twice as many white parents opt out of their zone schools in gentrifying neighborhoods than white parents in other neighborhoods. The schools they enroll their children in have 19% fewer free lunch eligible students and 14% fewer Black and Hispanic students, which is far higher than the differences for white choosers in other neighborhoods. This pattern is similar but not as dramatic for non-free lunch eligible students. This confirms a growing body of research that finds that white and higher income families are more likely to exercise school choice if they live in diverse neighborhoods or ones undergoing demographic shifts. One recent study even found that a neighborhood is more likely to gentrify if school choice policies are enacted in the district, allowing white and higher income parents to move into a neighborhood but to avoid its schools. Our final set of findings discusses how these patterns impact the distribution of elementary students across our public schools. Although a lot of great research and journalism over the past few years has documented the inequitable outcomes of citywide high school choice in New York City, we still hear the excuse at the elementary level that our schools are segregated because our housing is segregated. But our research has revealed that 40% of kindergarten students choose their schools, and the ones who choose are disproportionately Black, higher income, and/or English proficient. 10,000 of these kindergarten students are leaving their district every morning, often traveling from lower income neighborhoods towards higher income neighborhoods, from Crown Heights to Fort Greene, from Fort Greene to Park Slope. They are enrolling in schools with lower concentrations of poverty and higher test scores, which may indeed lead to higher academic outcomes for those individual students down the road, but they are leaving behind schools with higher concentrations of poverty, larger shares of English language learners, and declining enrollment. The average zoned elementary school lost more than 30 students from its zone than it received from the other zones last year. That is more than a full kindergarten class, and it's twice the amount those schools lost from their zones 10 years ago. With declining enrollment, these schools are facing shrinking budgets, and because they have higher need populations, they are forced to do more with less. We also found that the schools would be slightly less segregated if all students attended their zone schools, instead of exercising school choice. We did this by calculating several measures of segregation for all of the schools and comparing them to the same measure for all of the zones. Using the dissimilarity index, for example, which captures the proportion of students who would have to move in order to have perfectly balanced enrollment across all schools or zones in that district, we found that the Black and white students in the average district would be 7% less segregated if they all attended their zone kindergartens. Free lunch eligible students would be 10% less segregated from non-eligible students if they all attended their zone kindergartens. This is the average difference across all districts in the city. Several districts saw differences here of over 30%. We also found that students in each group would be slightly less isolated and more exposed to other groups. Lastly, we also calculated how many students would be in schools that meet the goals set by the Department of Education in their diversity plan. We found that 6,300 more kindergarten students would be in schools that were near the citywide poverty average, and 2,300 more would be in racially representative schools, which have between 50 and 90% Black and Hispanic students. These numbers, added up over a few years of kindergarten classes, could bring the city much closer to its diversity plan goals, and to a more equitable distribution of students by race and class. I do not mean to suggest that our schools would suddenly be integrated if all students attended their zone schools. By all counts, they would still be far too segregated and would need to engage in the hard work of real integration before that could change. Also, we cannot assume that in the absence of public school choice policies, that all the same families would stay in the public school system. Those with enough privilege to do so may move to a different zone or city altogether, or send their children to private schools. However, this does pose a serious challenge to the excuse that our schools are segregated because our housing is. And in to the market logic that assumes schools will improve in response to greater competition from choice. Even though some students clearly benefit from choice, it's time for us to consider the collective equity effects of school choice on the students who are less able to choose, the schools who struggle more as a result of these choices, and the effect that this is having on the ties that have traditionally bound our schools to their communities. With that, I'd like to introduce Claire Hemphill to the podium to welcome our panel.
So let's have a little light on the stage here, and let's call up, we have 3 of our panelists here, and 2 of them are stuck in traffic. So we have Dennis Morgan and Uju Argalal and Allison Rhoda will come up, and Maya Wiley and Betty Rosa. Maya Wiley is coming from Detroit this morning, and Betty Rosa is coming from Albany, and they should be here shortly. I'm going to ask some questions of the panelists. Oh, it looks like, is this Betty Rosa here? Here she is. Perfect timing. But she only came from Albany, and Maya Wiley's coming from Detroit, so give Maya a break. And she's coming from LaGuardia, which I think is particularly difficult to drive from. I'm going to ask some questions of the panelists for about 45 minutes, and then we will have questions from the audience. You all have index cards, and if you write your question on the index cards, we'll have people from the center collect them and shuffle them and give us the most provocative and interesting ones. Maybe not the most provocative, the most interesting ones. My first question for the panelists is, what surprised you the most about Nicole's research? Does anyone want to start? Dennis?
You can hear me okay if I project, everybody? I'm going to move this just a little closer. I speak very softly. This way everybody can hear me. I think, the last piece that Nicole, I think her name is Nicole, had touched on regarding the way gentrification affects schools and school choice and where people choose to go. I think it's something that I see in Harlem all the time. Having lived there for 19 years now, I've seen an incredible amount of change, but I don't think I've sort of put that lens on it that says, as our neighborhoods change and more white people come into our neighborhoods and people with more money come into our neighborhoods, I don't think it's clear the correlation until I sort of saw it put through that sort of lens and that sort of understanding. It's a really interesting idea. I think there's a lot of other pieces that might be affected by it, but I see it all the time, every day, that the families move in, and I see their children in the morning getting on the bus and leaving our neighborhoods. I live right across the street from the school that my children go to, and I see a number of parents and families that are bused to other portions of the district. All those buses head downtown. They don't head uptown or anywhere else, from what I can tell.
Uju, what surprised you? I see you nodding. What surprised you most about the report? And I should point out that Uju is one of Nicole's professors and is...
Yeah, well, I was just, the whole report is quite impressive, and I think in terms of both the data sets and analysis, but I think what it shows, in line with what Dennis is saying, I think is, so my work is, I'm a qualitative researcher. I conducted both historical and ethnographic study of choice, and the ethnography focuses on District 3. And I've worked in the district for a very long time. What we have known is exactly what you said, right? That a number of students already travel, but the statistics that Nicole is able to bring forward in the clear analysis to show that this is a systemic and citywide issue, that students are indeed traveling. It's not a question of being relegated to one zone, or the question of neighborhood schools for some and travel for others, or that travel might put an undue burden on young children, which is one of the excuses that we often hear against desegregation plans, right? But Nicole's research demonstrates otherwise, that children already travel. A good majority of them do. So I think that was one of the things that stood out for me the most amongst her other findings as well.
Allison, what surprised you?
First, I would just like to say how clear and concise the report was, and very well done, Nicole.
That surprised you?
No, it wasn't. That's not surprising. No, it wasn't surprising at all. The amount of movement is surprising overall. The amount of students that are opting out of their neighborhood schools, when I believe if we look across the United States, 90%, it hovers around 90% going to public schools.
Going to their zone school.
Yes, neighborhood schools. And I'm also a qualitative researcher, so looking at the numbers and the patterns, I try to understand the how and the why questions. So talking to parents, talking to school leaders about these issues. And it really is, I love the title of the report too, this paradox of choice. Because there is this debate between school choice and neighborhood schools, and opting into your neighborhood schools or opting out and using school choice. And so I think on a lot of fronts, my qualitative research helps us understand the patterns, and I found a lot of similarities with the data.
Chancellor Rosa, what surprised you about the report?
First of all, I think that some of what has been said is really linked to the fact that we, in this state, you know, if you go outside of the state, it's a slightly different situation, but we are so segregated. Our communities are so segregated, our schools are so segregated. So what is happening, to me, it's beyond a paradox. It's a response to how our communities are established. And whether it's the redlining that takes place, or whether it's the way that our communities have evolved, even in the gentrification communities, you begin to see these patterns of schools that once upon a time were neighborhood schools. All of a sudden you have this movement of making them look a certain way, and then the label of high performing gets added on. And so the other part that we don't talk about, and it's to me, the elephant in the room, is the issue of poverty. And the issue of poverty in educating kids. And so the idea of, you know, this whole idea of privilege, this whole idea of who gets to go where, who gets choice, who's informed about choice, is also part of this conversation. And I think a lot of times we don't pay enough attention to the issue of how this information gets shared, disseminated, and how people in particular access that information and make decisions about these choices.
What surprised me was something we haven't brought up, is that the free lunch rate of kindergartners citywide has declined from, that is the proportion of kids who are poor enough to qualify for free lunch, has declined from 80% 10 years ago to 69% last year. So one of the problems, one of the barriers to socioeconomic integration has been that we have large swaths of high concentration of poverty. So it's very hard to have integrated schools if you have no middle-class kids, and that is socioeconomically integrated schools. And what we're finding is that the middle class is staying in the city when their kids reach school age, or not moving to the suburbs, and that as a result, we have, I think, the potential of socioeconomic integration now when we didn't, it's the first time in maybe 50 years since the white flight to the suburbs that we've had that. The racial makeup, the racial and ethnic makeup is pretty stable over the last 10 years. That is, it's about 17% white, about 17% Asian, about 40% Latino, and about 24% African American. The proportion of African Americans has shrunk a little bit, and the number of Asians has gone up a little bit, but it's been roughly the same. So for me, it's that we have the potential for socioeconomic integration, which we, have not had for a long time. Uju, you spent lots of Nicole's report is lots of numbers, very impressive numbers, but the rest of you have spent some time talking to actual parents or being actual parents. Uju, you've particularly talked to lots of parents of color trying to navigate school choice. What are their experiences?
Sure. So I conducted an ethnographic study where I followed poor and working class parents of color, as well as middle and income parents as they navigated kindergarten admissions for their children in District 3. And one of the things I found was, one of the claims that we often hear about school choice is that poor parents don't understand choice, that they're not empowered enough to claim rights, that they don't understand, that they don't have access to the same information. In the case of District 3 and the parents that I worked with—
Which is the Upper West Side and Harlem.
Yeah, thank you. But this was not true. Parents were well-informed, knew their choices, had done their research, even went to go visit schools together, developed a strategy to go visit schools together in order to help each other navigate the system and defend one another and provide translation for one another when language access was an issue. And yet, despite all of this, right, choice was not an option for them. They were not granted admission, right, despite all of this labor. So I think we have to really think, again, about the real questions that Nicole's report and research raises around who has choice, what does choice do. And I think the other thing that I learned that Allison and I were talking about earlier is, we often think about the significance of individual intention. One of the things that I found was that, as we know, choice is based on an idea of market logics, right? So the idea of competition, as Nicole talked about earlier. And one of the things that choice, though, does and did, right, that I found for middle income and upper middle income parents in District 3 was create a very intensified myopia, right, where all they were able to see or care about was their own children. A competition was assumed, and consumer citizenship also was amplified, right? So it was natural to see another person in competition with you, rather than thinking about public schools as they are, as a public resource, a public good, something that could serve as a community resource rather than as an individual one. So I think, while it's important to have consciousness raising and all these, and think about the individual impacts of racism and exclusion, we really do need structural policies, because without that, individual choices are limited. And again, choice often results in an intensified, again, idea of myopia, caring about oneself, individual consumer citizenship, that we see DeVos and others quite in favor of, right? So I think we have an opportunity to really question what we're investing in or not.
That's, of course, the premise of school choice, is that individual parents know best what's right for their child, and it's their responsibility and also their privilege to choose what's right for their child. But as you point out, what's right for an individual might not be, might not translate into things that are good for the community.
Yeah, and just one quick addition. I think as we think about equity, we have to really think about who has been most excluded and center those voices and experience and break apart this idea of parents, quote unquote, as, you know, a monolithic group. And really, right, just as the limitations of participatory budgeting show and its possibilities as well, it's not just about participation, it's not just about choice, but it really is about centering those who have been most excluded in thinking about how to create more equitable systems.
I'm going to ask Dennis. I'm going to ask Dennis about how choice works out in his school. It's PS 180 in Harlem. It's in the northern end of District 3. Dennis is also on the Community Education Council for District 3, which one of the responsibilities of the CEC is to draw up zoning lines.
Yes.
At PS 180, if everyone who lived in the PS 80 zone attended PS 180, it would be 25% white and would have a free lunch rate, that is a poverty rate, of 51%.
Right.
But just half of the children who live in the zone and attend public school enroll in PS 180. And of the kids who attend, they're 10% white and 70% free lunch.
Yes.
So the school has fewer white kids than it would otherwise and a lot more free lunch. Tell me about the kids who leave and tell me about the kids who want to get in but can't.
Yeah, so I think a lot of what you said, Uju, is right. We see a lot of parents sort of grouping together and making their decisions together. A lot of times, well, I should say that's sort of balanced across both, whether they opt out or stay in. You know, I live in a building, and the building next to it are almost mirror images of one another. And there's a cohort of parents within the other building that several years ago had decided that our school wasn't right for them. A lot of this conversation, I found, takes place at the playground. Like a lot of the influence and the way that people are choosing happens not necessarily in the school building or after a tour, but at the local playground through conversations with other parents. And it generally takes an influencer to sort of change that and redirect that, because there's a large group of families, like I said, that they go to 163, I think is one of the G&T schools, and everyone sort of decided, like, G&T is what we need, we want to
And that's down, you're on 120th, and that's down on 97th Street.
Yes, correct.
And it has a gifted and talented
Yep.
program that it's a zone school, but it
Correct.
also takes kids from outside the zone.
Yeah, especially
who
for
pass the
G&T.
test.
It also has they recently, I don't know how long ago it was, but they also included a dual language component as well. So I think a lot of those decisions are happening not necessarily at the school and during tours. I think they're happening through conversations to sort of reinforce what Uju was saying. I think what we see within the school, and I think our demographics are changing. I think some of the numbers we had talked about yesterday is that more kids are staying within the zone over the last few years. That number is growing. But I think, again, this comes down to the way parents sort of, I guess one of the things that I've been focused on is this idea of onboarding parents when they come in for the tour. So we have a really strong pre-K program, an early childhood development program at 180 that's highly sought within the Upper West Side. It's just got a lot of strong leadership. And we sort of use that, or I've been using that as a mechanism to sort of draw in and bring people closer to the conversation of what the school really has to offer. And I think I provide this to the group and a part of the panel to say that I'm looking at ways to sort of attract parents with more wealth, parents that don't necessarily fit the current demographic, and trying to use this idea of community, and not just community school, which is what we are, but also this idea that this is a place for you, right? This school is in transition, it's growing, it's looking for people to help build it, and I think that resonates with a lot of people who are interested, invested in public schools. I think a lot of what we've seen in the numbers shows that there's sort of an apprehension to your zone public school, especially within District 3. I mean, I've done no research. I'm not a researcher. I'm more a researcher, I guess, on human behaviors and what people feel. And I think when I'm speaking to these people about our school, and I'm speaking to people at the district level, they're looking for camaraderie, right? They're looking for a place they can belong. And I don't know if everyone has to belong in a social group where we all look alike. I think I'm finding a lot of parents that are willing to and interested in exploring more diversity. I think we really want that at the end of the day, and I'm trying to provide them an avenue or a channel or a solution that helps them sort of come into the school, see where the places are that they can help build and grow, and really sort of build the school in the image that they feel is right.
It's one of the things that I really loved about your school was that feeling of community.
Yeah,
And it has a multiracial PTA.
yes.
No one group seems to dominate the PTA, at least from what I
No,
could
it's
see.
changed a lot, and I think it's about, like, my expectation is that, because I'm also the PTA president, I don't have a lot of other time for other things, but I think my expectation for parents that come in for the tour is that we're all gonna get our hands dirty. Public schools are about building public schools, at least at this time. It's not like when I grew up where it seemed to sort of be, I was young at the time, of course, but it seemed like it was on autopilot. You just sort of show up and it's moving and there's things going on, but it feels like we have to build them together. And I think people are looking to do that, especially in our neighborhood. I don't know if they necessarily want to leave their zone school. I think they don't feel they have an option within their zone school. I think they feel like it's just not gonna be safe, or it's not gonna be the right educational model. But I think if I can bring them in and we can get together and understand together, like, what do we need for our children, that we can make a collective decision and work with the administration to build the school we think is right for our community.
Allison, you've researched. Allison, you've researched, done research with parents of different races in different neighborhoods in the city.
Yes.
Tell me a little bit about white parents and their anxiety of those that you've talked to, and how they approach the G&T test compared to black parents?
Yeah. Well, I wanted to piggyback a little bit on Yiju and Dennis about this. We make a lot of assumptions about why parents are choosing certain schools and that they want to group together, but when we're not giving them diverse choices, it's hard for them to make that choice. And so there is this, I think, growing movement of parents. I studied District 30 in Jackson Heights, and there's
In Queens, yeah.
in Queens, there's a group of a diverse group of families that have come together and organized. So we really have this moment of time when there is gentrification and parents can mobilize and opt into their neighborhood schools. So this group is saying, and they're rejecting this consumer model of school choice, that we have to shop around and we have to apply to all of the options, and we have to get our child tested for gifted. They're rejecting that, and they're saying our neighborhood schools are good. They might not look good from the outside. The test scores aren't the best. They're Title I schools. But when you go inside and you meet the teachers and you go on the school tours, they're good schools. And they also want diversity. A lot of parents, they choose to live in Jackson Heights or other diverse communities because of the diversity. So why not choose a neighborhood school that reflects that diversity? And they want the convenience. A lot of parents grew up in suburban areas. They like to walk to school. That's what they did when they were little. And so the convenience, the lifestyle choice of just walking across the street, walking down the block to your neighborhood school, and really democracy. So teaching their children that we're going to support all children. We're going to be advocates for all children instead of just our own child. So those are some of the themes that I've heard in Jackson Heights, and now in Brooklyn too with District 17. They have a group called Live Here, Learn Here. So there are these movements. There is parents mobilizing to affect change, and I think what is needed is integration policy at the district level to support schools that are demographically changing, because they've been put in this position to market themselves and act like businesses, and they need help recruiting parents, and not all schools have dentists to to tell parents all about the good things, but in Jackson Heights, they do. They have an organization that is advocating giving other parents support, because there is so much pressure, social pressure, to opt out and leave the neighborhood for gifted and talented programs and for charter schools. And these are the boutique type mom and pop charter schools with the special themes. So, yeah.
So what you're saying is that although our data shows there's a huge increase in the number of parents opting out of their zone school over the last 10 years, there's a kind of grassroots movement in a number of neighborhoods that you've studied that show the reverse. That is, parents who want to invest in their zone school,
Yes.
and that we haven't seen that in the data yet, but that may be something which is coming along. You said we need to do something at the district level. I think we also need to do something at the city and state level. And I want to ask Betty Rosa what the state can do to foster, well, first of all, do you think choice is a good thing or a bad thing, or?
Put her on the hot seat.
We'll be here the whole day, but let me just say that I don't have an issue with the concept of choice. I have an issue with the fact that it's a code, and I think we are very dishonest in many ways. When we talk about a market, you talked about competition. In competition, you have winners and losers. In competition and choice, you have definitions that we don't talk about. The elephant in the room is, what is a good school? And a good school, to some people, the first thing they think about is race, okay? And so I think part of what is unsettling for me and in many of these conversations are the courageous conversations that we need to have and the way we define what is a good school. I mean, I heard some of you talk about gifted and talented. Well, who has access to those? If we use standardized, as my colleagues would say, if we use standardized tests as a way of giving access or denying access, as we do with many of our high schools that are specialized, right? So if we have this notion of who has access, how do we define all of these things, and we come down to even thinking about a neighborhood school is not good enough. It's not good enough because, in many cases, even if people move into a neighborhood because they want because of moral reasoning, because of tolerance, because of respect for diversity, many times those choices are still different.
Let me interrupt you.
so-
I was asking, what can the
Well,
state do?
yeah, well,
And
the
one of the
state-
things, the state controls the purse strings.
Yeah, but
And do you think we'll ever get the $2 billion from the Campaign for Fiscal Equity?
no, but that is not, first of all, let me be clear, that's a lawsuit that obviously is built into our executive, meaning that the state, not the state department, but the state as we defined it in terms of legislators and our governor is responsible for, we make proposals for budget, SED, and we are subject, we are the recipients of those dollars as a result of the negotiation that takes place with legislators and the executive. It's not as if, we would want those dollars and actually pass on those dollars. But the reason I went where I did is that you know, when you talk about the dollars and when you talk about the decisions that are made at the state level, we have a fixed amount of dollars that come in, Title I dollars. We have a fixed amount that comes in as a result of what is given to us as a result of the negotiation that goes across the street. Those dollars get passed on to the districts. And again, it's a system issue. But at the same time, you asked me the question about choice. The question of choice is a very different conversation, and I don't want people to walk out thinking that if you give more dollars or if you give less dollars, that's going to fix it. And certainly we know resources are important, but at the same time, how resources get distributed and how resources get added on. Many of these schools, as you well know, PTAs raise a lot of other dollars that are invisible dollars many times and add to the quality and back to the choice. So I think it's a very narrow way of saying, CFE, yes, we should get those dollars. I testified, I think my colleague Kathy Cashin testified, to make sure that New York City and New York State, particularly New York City, particularly my judicial district, the Bronx, would get some of these dollars to support the very schools that we know have the very children that in many cases are not even, choice isn't even the issue. Many of these children are warehoused in many conditions that parents who even think about choice wouldn't even think that they would allow their children to be educated in those situations. So while I do want to be academic about the answer, I also want to make sure that we walk out of here knowing that there are so many codes and so many ways that when we talk about choice, what we really mean, and let's be honest about it. Let's not mask it, let's not disguise it, and let's not build up the winners. And like even when I'm hearing this panel, what's disturbing to me is to think that if the school, it's almost like a white privilege conversation, and it's the positive on one side and the negative on the other, that the poor kids are somehow going to have a negative impact on those schools, because the white kids are going to have a positive. So we've got to build it from that side. And again, it's back to the winners or losers. So I just want to answer your question about the finances. Our finances are one of the things that we're looking at. We have been looking at for the last couple of years, making sure that the schools that are the neediest, we have under ESSA a transparency issue, and we're trying to put out so people see where these dollars are going, because I will tell you sitting here that many districts receive their allocation, but at the same time, sometimes even when they lose the students, they keep the dollars. And at the same time, and those are held harmless, at the same time, when we look at how much a particular wealthy school district gets, they may not get Title I. And in some cases, by the way, we do have some districts that are wealthy who do get Title I. But they do get other dollars that are raised to support the kind of education that those students receive. And believe me, it's a high-quality economic education versus a low-quality economic education in many of the poor communities.
So Maya, hello, welcome from, glad you made it from Detroit this morning. Maya, you're the co-chair of the Mayor's Diversity Committee, which is charged, as well as being a professor at the New School, and your committee is charged with coming up with some solutions.
Recommendations,
Recommendations.
just to be clear.
So can you give me an example of some of the things you're looking at and some of the things that might happen? What the city can do even without state or federal help?
So, thank you, and I apologize for being late. I was literally at the Wayne County Community College District last night, and I share that because I think what the student body is seeing in Wayne County, which is Detroit, which of course has one of the most virulent histories of white flight from school integration, is that Wayne County as a community college is also experiencing segregation at the community college level based on campus because of housing patterns. And so I just share that because there's really, in a national context, this is a national problem, not just a New York City problem. So let me just say, the working group is actually called a working group, and I co-chair it with Jose Calderon from Hispanic Federation and Hazel Dukes from the NAACP. We have 2 other executive committee members, including the 3 of us, which is Amy Sin from Queens College, and also Richard Kahlenberg, who you may know because he's one of the foremost researchers on school desegregation and integration. So, but the working group itself is made up of, I think it's 40 people. It's a very, very large group and very intentional effort to have it be encompassing of stakeholders, right, in this conversation about integration and diversifying our schools. So superintendents, principals, teachers, parents, students, advocates are all represented in the membership. And we have tried very, very hard to have as transparent and inclusive a process as possible, because what we will do is by the December of this year, have formal recommendations that we make to the city. It's an advisory group. It is not a decision-making group, so that's why I say recommendations, and it'll be all of our jobs to do the advocacy around the recommendations themselves if we agree. So there is a website. I should have had it available because we also have the opportunity for any of you or anyone in the city to also give us feedback, recommendations online. So I just say that because we want to hear from you. The idea is, and we've been having literally town hall meetings all over the city that are public. We've had 450 people attend so far in the Bronx, in Queens and Jackson Heights. I met some of those white parents who've been organizing on integration, and in Brooklyn, and we will, on the website or the other locations. You don't have to live in the borough to attend, though, just to be clear. And we are planning to have an all-student town hall so that we can get a higher percentage of students being able to participate in the conversation. So our starting point is the plan that the Department of Education put out in June 2017. In other words, the Department of Education already instituted, here's what we think we can do now and that we're committed to doing, which of course the Center for New York City Affairs has also done a report on evaluating. It's what they believe the impact would be, and I recommend reading that report as well. As
By the
one we
way,
have
our
today.
report, for those of you who haven't read it, said it wouldn't really do much, and that it was no heavy lifting was
right.
the
So
headline.
look, here's the point, and I really want to both appreciate the Department of Education, and because I think sometimes we have these conversations as if we are in pitched battle, which, and actually we have a Department of Education that itself put this together as an effort to do more, and starting with the working group by saying, tell us if we're getting it right. So it wasn't a rubber stamp this. It was a let's talk honestly about it, and the working group itself has said, so we're trying to organize the discussion and recommendations around essentially what can the city do now, starting looking and evaluating the plan, but what should also be medium and long-term strategies. Now, our focus is going to focus on the now, because obviously we want to start to have impact, but also include what many have raised both in our public meetings and in our working group meetings, not only looking at this in the short term, but also making sure we're taking account of the long term. So the kinds of things that are coming up in our discussions are everything, obviously, from enrollment in specialized high schools to controlled choice to zoning and boundaries, but also really fundamentally to things like curriculum, curricular diversity, right? Diversity of staff, not thinking about teachers, not just students, thinking about what it means to be a welcoming school. We have schools that are highly diverse, non-white, that are saying we are diverse and we don't want to get left out of a discussion about what resource allocations look like based on our diversity, to some of the points that we've heard, which I think are incredibly important conversations to have been raised. I'm just going to say Bronx District 12, for example, that's like, we look the way we look. You can change the, I mean, you'd have to make the boundaries really, really big to change the way we look. What about us? And what about the ways we want to think about diversity? So I think one of the things that's very clear, at least to me personally, is it's critically important that we recognize with 1.1 million children in our schools that cover 330 square miles, that we are not going to have a one-size-fits-all. And whatever our recommendations are going to be are probably going to be multifaceted. The only reason I'm not saying what they are is because we don't have them yet. We're still in the listening process of hearing from parents, hearing from teachers, hearing from students, hearing from community members, so that it's not just a process of being informed by the research, and it must be research-based from our standpoint, the recommendations we make, but it's also informed by the very real lived experiences, desires, and aspirations of the people we say we're trying to serve with our recommendations.
I'm going to ask another couple questions and then take questions from the audience. If you would write your questions on an index card, we'll have some people come by and collect them. Dennis, you are on the CEC,
Yes.
Community Education Council for District 3 on the Upper West Side and Harlem, and one of your responsibilities is to redraw zone lines. Tell me how things are working out. There were
I don't think anybody has any idea what you're talking about.
So on 191 was a school that was mostly served kids from the housing developments, the NYCHA housing developments, and 191 did not mostly serve those kids. And you all changed the zone lines in, I think, about 10 schools in order to mix things up a bit, which actually made our data impossible to figure out. How is that working out on the ground? Is it a harmonious change?
So I've met with several parents post rezoning. I think that the fire and the raging fire is not there anymore. I think there are still concerns and people are apprehensive, but I think we've done the right thing to start making the right steps in the district. It's so funny with District 3 because I think for the first part of this year, everything was pretty much like really focused on Uptown and Harlem. And I think that all of those conversations that we had had with families and parents that were fuming during the rezoning, I think they lost interest because our focus had moved uptown in how to create equity. I don't think they were feeling the same sort of fire, and I think it's one of those things, right? Because the decision is being made and because change is happening, I think people feel concerned, scared. What will this change do to me? What is this going to do with the demographics of my community? What is it going to do to my schools? I think those fears have somewhat resolved to some extent. We're not being sued any longer.
That's good, right?
Yeah. When those things come off the table, you sort of feel like, oh, okay, well, maybe everybody's all right now. I think we're seeing lower. So one of the reasons that we had done it because there was a lot of overcrowding as well in our district. I think the latest reports show that a lot of that has been reduced considerably, and I think the decisions we made to sort of rezone and the way that we went about the rezoning has had a positive impact on it. I'm sure you will find a handful of parents who probably are still concerned about their property value that they thought was going to go down because now their school that they're zoned for has children that qualify for free lunch or are African American or brown. But I think a lot of that has subsided.
One of the things that I noticed at those meetings was that a lot of the people who were speaking out didn't actually have children in the schools.
Yeah. Yeah. I think they were, yeah. They were concerned citizens.
Okay, and
I don't want to pray to, you know, the worst thing, one of the things that I get into is I paint this really broad brush, and I don't think that's necessarily fair to all of them. But I think everyone was very concerned, and everyone sort of, you know, again, going back to what Uju said, they're all sort of looking at this like, for me, like, what's going to happen to me? What's going to happen to me? What's going to happen to my child? And I think the thing we try to do on the CEC is we try to take a much broader perspective and understand, just as you said, there's a lot of different me's out there that we're trying to serve. And it's not going to be one size fits all. It's not going to feel good to some of you. It's going to feel great to others. I actually, anecdotally, my friend, very close, my best friend, who lives in New York as well, he's from Los Angeles, and he moved into one of the districts we've rezoned. We do still talk and we still communicate, but generally over drinks he'll bring it up like, hey man, I was zoned for that school, why did you do this to me? And I'm like, look, you're actually going to be in a much better place. Here are the values about the school that you're now in. And it's one of those things I think, you know, despite what some of the research shows and how many people are choosing other schools, we have a lot of really good schools in District 3. A lot of really good schools, and a lot of really good leaders, and a lot of really good educators. And I think that that's something that should be considered for all of the parents that thought that something horrible was going to happen to them.
your district has also been in, oh, Uju, sure.
Can I add a quick comment? So this past year, so I continue to be involved in an organizing initiative called the Parent Leadership Project that is led by poor and working class mothers of color in the district seeking for a long time desegregation. Oh, I see somebody raising their hand. We can't hear. Oh, that's a note card. I see Lori Falke, who's been a long supporter and a member of that work as well. And Marlene Hidalgo, I was sad couldn't join the panel, but one of the things we've noticed this past year is, so again, going back to my note about other people trying to choose as well and their experiences. So I'll just share one story. One mother from the group, a member, tried to exercise choice, was filled out the forms, was assigned to a school that she did not choose, went to that school and was told, well, if you don't enroll your child here, we'll have ACS come take your child away, right? So this is an experience also of poor and working class parents of color who are trying to exercise choice, who know their rights, who research the schools well, and yet this is what they're met with. So when we talk about kind of anxiety and care and concern, we also have to think about what that means on the other side, right? When the, so yeah, just to,
Can I'm sorry I was late, and so maybe this point got raised, but I really want to make sure that the reason I stressed that one of the principles that the working group is operating from is research-based is because so much deep research demonstrates the shared educational benefit to integrated schools. And so that if we can actually work our way into an actual conversation about what we know makes schools effective, I think it will also improve the conversation we're having around people's anxieties about the impacts on them. And I also want to reinforce Uju's point, because we have lots of people with lots of experiences that create a lot of fear about what decisions will be made around schools, and we want to be reflective of all of those.
That's unbelievable, Uju, that they said child welfare
in
would.
fact, it's not, right? It's not the only case. It's not an isolated case. And I think that is what we need to kind of, again, for years, the parents of first the Center for Immigrant Families that I worked with, and then the Parent Leadership Project now, have been told that they're anomalies. They are not. And I think that's what Nicole's research shows very well, right? With the data she's collected and analyzed. But I think we really need to then take the risk right? Of listening and centering people as, again, not anomalies, as not uninformed or confused, but this is actually happening on a daily basis to a number of parents.
And that the resources matter for this reason. So also to Chancellor Rosa's point, that there is no policy change that becomes an unfunded mandate that will produce success. And I think we need to recognize that, because around this point that Uju's making, one of the things that we have heard in our conversations in town halls and in our working group meetings is the need for training and support to make effective any recommendations we make. And I think it's really critical to understand it's not just the recommendations themselves or the policy shifts, but the actual investment in the implementation.
Yes.
Yeah, I just want to ask Allison, because sometimes these proposals work pretty well, and sometimes they don't. And could you tell us a little bit about the difference between how District 3 is working towards a middle school choice that seems a little bit fairer, and how Park Slope and Sunset Park and District 15 in Brooklyn is doing it?
Well, I just started a research project in District 15 and have been hearing from the CEC and parents about their plan for middle school equity. And it's been a long-term plan. They've held parent meetings and hired a WXY outside firm to come in and collect data and provide some recommendations for what they could do. Basically, in District 15, what I heard was there were 3 highly sought-after middle schools for a very long time, and they were disproportionately white and higher income schools, and it was becoming impossible to get into those schools. And so now gentrification there's more white families, there's more affluent middle-class African-American families and Latino families and Asian families too that want more diversity in the schools. They see the inequities, and so this is also parents coming together and voicing their opinions about what should be done. And their approach is to get parent buy-in first and get their voice before they provide any top-down policy recommendations. And I think that is a good strategy. Seems like the parents that I spoke to so far feel like they have a voice. And again, when I think about integration and desegregation, and it's not enough just to create desegregation where there's this balance of race, ethnicities, and socioeconomic backgrounds in a school, but you need to also work towards integration, and that goes much deeper. And that is where I'm hearing parents say, we don't have, and school leaders and teachers, we don't have the support from the district, we don't have enough resources, we need racial justice trainings in our schools. We need to create schools that are welcoming to all families and have the tools to undo racism and anti-bias training for teachers. And so integration, that's not really part of the conversation yet, I think, but we should also think about that when we're talking about creating more diversity. And in districts like District 15, District 3, there is gentrification. So there is this moment where we know the housing's segregated. We know that school choice policy advantages certain families and allows certain privileged families to hoard opportunities. But with gentrification, we do have this moment where we could create more desegregated and integrated spaces.
I have a question from the audience for Chancellor Rosa. What role do the state tests play in segregation, and why is New York City's opt-out rate so much lower than New York State? can the money spent on these tests be better spent?
First, let me start by saying, absolutely, the tests do play, because obviously, if you have the conversations with many of these parents that, as you said, who have voice, I'm not so sure that who has voice in District 15 and who's at the table, right? So when many of these parents who have voice and have access and have the opportunities to look, they do look at the test scores, but they also look at the test scores from who gets into gifted and talented. So it isn't just using the state test, you're also using other kinds of measurement to add to the conversation about who gets into these programs. So the part A is, yes, these tests are being used for that purpose. The opt-out outside of New York City is larger because New York City, as an organization, as an institution, has put in place structures that do not allow for parents to opt their kids out if, in fact, you want to get into some of the middle schools. If, in fact, you know, if the middle school is saying this is a requirement and you want your kid in that middle school, then guess what? You fulfill the obligation of that requirement. You don't necessarily. Now, I think more and more parents are finding out that some of these schools, they could still opt out and still get the kid in, but that's a rare. So I think the structure in New York City, by design, has been set up to include, exclude, and have parents who can go to those places. And by that design, the test scores become key. So that's one. Can this test be used? Many of my colleagues would say, you know, let's get rid of standardized tests. Unfortunately, the federal requirements are you have to have standardized tests for accountability and to see where everybody is in terms of the state. There are many people that agree that these standardized tests don't necessarily inform instruction, which they don't. I think they inform, you know, a Kodak moment in time. It is for those of you who may not know it, it's roughly $44 million that is spent on these tests, but they're spent because we have an identification and an accountability system that the feds require. So it's not like we could say magically at the state, let's get rid of these standardized tests because we are required to have them. I would tell you sitting here that yes, on a personal level, I would prefer to spend those dollars. But those parents who want to know how well are their kids' school doing would want a comparison, right? Because you can't have, if you don't have a standardized test, how do you compare this apple to apple versus apple to oranges? So there are those few people that want the standardized test because that's in the crowd, because that's how they know across the board. Now, obviously the standardized tests, one last thing, the standardized tests do play to certain groups because they're able to do the test tutoring, they're able to have access, and guess what? The tests by design are designed with inference in mind. They're designed for certain groups that in fact play to the test. So certain groups that have abilities to pay for tutors, ability to create the higher order thinking skills, the kinds of, even if you don't get it in school, you know, I have a famous line that I said, if there are some schools, if the kids stayed home all year long, came in, took the test, those schools would do fine. I mean, that's a fact because of the economics. There is an economic issue, and the economics of test taking and the economics of the results, because we know all the states where they're high economic states are where the kids do well. All the states where they don't invest and the kids economically and they're economically they're not as, Massachusetts, New Jersey, you can name them all. You don't even have to take the test. I can tell you how well they're going to do.
I'm going to try to get through a lot of questions, so I'm going to ask everybody to have a really snappy soundbite answer, and I'll have a snappy soundbite question that anybody can answer. What are your thoughts on the recent tweet by New York Schools Chancellor Carranza referencing wealthy white Manhattan parents ranting against school diversity? Do you feel it was inappropriate or useful for shedding the spotlight on lack of school integration? Anybody?
The what?
Sure. It sounds like something that's hitting square in my district. So I think from my perspective, I don't think it's fanning any flames that haven't been there, right? I think he's exposing the truth that we all know is there, and we all need to take this moment to really look at it and try to understand, what are we really asking for, right? What are we trying to do to these schools?
That's snappy. I like it.
I feel like I had more, but that's all right. I want to be snappy.
District 1 in Manhattan is piloting a controlled choice system. Do you think this is a viable option to eventually get implemented in districts citywide? What are the flaws and challenges with a controlled choice plan? That's hard to be snappy. Somebody want to try?
Well, a controlled choice plan has to be coupled with diversity controls, because if all parents are choosing schools and ranking schools, if there's no mechanism to balance the diversity across the schools, you're going to create more segregation. You're not going to help.
Yeah, this is what I meant by one size does not fit all. We are too big a city with too much difference across different neighborhoods and areas of our city to say one idea will work for the whole city. And controlled choice is an idea we absolutely should be looking at and seeing where it can be effective in the city, and understand it's not going to be effective everywhere.
So for those of you
Sorry,
who...
just real quick on that as well. For District 1, I think, and building off of what Maya is saying, I think it's really critical to look at the place-based histories of exclusion and inequality and what those look like. So people who have fought for controlled choice in District 1, the plan is not what they fought for. And so to look at that long fight, I think is also important, because it helps us then differentiate between reform and transformative reform and reformist reform. So people like Lisa Donlin and others in District 1 who have fought long and hard for a full-on controlled choice policy, which is not the policy that is now being implemented. I think look to them, talk to them, seek out folks who have been working for a very long time, because again, these movements, while there is an increased recognition of the problem, people have been working for a very long time around these issues. And I think that, again, just to really emphasize what Maya is saying, that there's no one-size-fits-all answer. It really needs to look at, again, what inequality it has meant in a place, and then grow out of that, right? Understanding and again, centering the voices of those who have been excluded.
So for those of you who are not familiar with the Lower East Side's plan, it essentially puts the thumb on the scales for low-income kids who want to go to a school that has more high-income children, and gives preference to high-income kids who want to go to a school that has mostly low-income kids. The idea is that if we mix up the income levels, because class and race are so tied up in our country, that this will create integrated schools. And just one of the differences is Lower East Side. District 1 is a small district, which is pretty walkable, so you can go, the schools are just a couple of blocks apart from each other, so that transportation is not so much an issue, whereas on the Upper West Side in Harlem, you have a long, skinny district, which is 40 or 50 blocks, so that the transportation issues become more important, just for starters. I'm a parent of a District 23, that's Ocean Hill, Brownsville in Brooklyn. My daughter's in first grade. I'm also a new school employee. When researching schools, I've spent long hours researching in the district and outside. After evaluating the school and my financial status, I could not afford to send my daughter outside of the district, and I chose the best performing Brooklyn landmark. I'm a black mother frustrated with the educational system and competition. What can be done to address the concerns in the district to support the schools to perform better or make the parents in the district confident that their child could get a quality education in order to be successful? For those of you who couldn't read all the little charts, District 23 in Ocean Hill, Brownsville is one of the districts that loses lots of kids to other districts. It has no zone schools, but parents seem to be rather dissatisfied with their choices. Maya, you're nodding. You answer that.
I mean, because this is the kind of thing we are hearing when we're talking to communities, and this is why I really wanted to stress the importance of thinking about different parts of the city differently. There is some really important research that suggests that if you want to really integrate well, you have to think about the resources, as I'd said earlier, like transportation. So one is we are having communities say, but invest in our schools. Don't tell us we are going to lose investment because white people don't live in our neighborhood or won't come to our schools. We have to listen to that, right? We can't be so dogmatic that we're ignoring the actual plea from people for investment in their schools. And secondly, we also have to think about what are the resources that enable, to the extent we have forms of, whether it's controlled choice or other forms of options that we are opening up, which I very much hope we are opening up and making available to more people, particularly people who can't necessarily afford a lot of options, that they're getting resourced and supported. Maybe it's because they get free transportation for their child to get safely from their neighborhood to a school in another neighborhood. But here's my point. We're at a time of deep budget cuts. We're in a time of federal tax giveaways to the wealthy and to corporations that's going to disinvest in things like food stamps, health care. You can forget help on child care from the federal government. So we also want to think realistically about what we can afford to do well, because I will tell you, and I will tell the new cameras, we have to be successful. We cannot have failed experiments. Because once we do, there will be the forces that will tell us it's not possible when we know it is.
Very quickly, I want to add, I don't think we can afford not to invest. So I think
Thank you. We look forward to all the money you'll be sending out of that.
Yeah. I have to say that despite your comment about picking, and being very strategic and very intentional, I agree. But I think we've been that way for a long time, and we still continue to focus and leave many, many kids. So my quick response would bring back the former superintendent of District 23, Kathy Cashin.
She's sitting in the front row, and if you want to ask her opinion about what to do on District 23 schools afterwards, I'm sure she would be happy to talk to you. Dr. Cashin, just raise your hand so the District 23 mother can find you. There was a couple years back, there was a page one story in the New York Times about how Dr. Cashin had improved things in District 23. Unfortunately, that was quite a while ago, and things may have changed since she left. Question for Chancellor Rosa: what are the next steps with the SES integration pilot? For those of you who don't know, the socioeconomic integration project is designed to come up with plans to have better socioeconomic integration. Each school gets $50,000 to $70,000. Chancellor Rosa, what are the next steps?
Yeah, I think, and I did submit the plan to you so that instead of, so people can have access to it, you could put it on the website. those school districts that are participating in it. So very quickly, we have both a research, Luis Reyes is here, a research committee that's looking at this issue for the entire state in terms of inclusiveness, diversity, equity, and integration. But we're also looking at some of these pilots and the kind of work so that those will inform collectively all of our work in terms of the state. So we're using that as a way of messaging the importance, not only in New York City, but also throughout the state, the importance of the issue of equity, integration, but more than integration, the whole idea of inclusiveness. How do we create opportunities for various districts throughout the state to engage in these conversations? So the plan is available, since you want a quick answer, and we're more than glad to share that with you so you can see those particular districts that are doing this lift. Thank you.
Question for Mr. Morgan. Assuming the essence of gentrification is non-conscientious consumption, isn't the come build with us argument from Mr. Morgan just preaching to the choir? How do we reach or manage that gentrifier dimension of choice issue?
There's a lot of big words in there. If I'm to understand what he's asking, or what the person is asking, and I'm trying here, how do we reach out to people who are coming into the neighborhood and finding a proper message for them? Is that about what they're asking?
Your guess is as good as mine,
Yeah.
actually.
I wish I could. Oh. So, I guess it's, to be honest, I don't think that's the type of person that we're looking for at our school. Yeah, and that's okay. That's okay that they're moving in. Now, if 100% of the people are moving in like that, which I think is unlikely, then I think there's a different conversation. But handful of people, one person, here's the thing, right? You're gonna have people who come into the school and just drop their kids off and walk away, right? That's not the behavior that we're looking for to build our school. We don't want to encourage people to not participate. Like, we want people who are going to participate. We don't, it's one of the, I guess, I'm trying to think of an analogy on the fly here, but I guess, if you have a job, and it's a job that you just sort of go in, punch the clock, and leave, then that's not a job that's, like, it's not enough, right? Like, you need something, and you need to have values, and you need to have a reason. And when your kids are there, I think you make a deeper investment, or at least I hope you do. I think from my perspective, and if I'm trying to sort of lead by example, like, I'm gonna be present. I'm gonna be present not just in the home, but also at the school, because I think it's important. And I think that's the type of parents that we want to attract. If there's gonna be parents who just want to sort of come in and drop off, that's fine, but I'm not gonna make any sort of special efforts to bring them in unless they really want to be there and participate. Thank you for clarifying, though. I appreciate that. Thank you.
Could Allison talk more about inequality in the gifted and talented programs and what might be the solution or recommendation to the issues? In 15 seconds, please.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, well, so parents are the gatekeepers to the gifted and talented programs in New York City. They have to go through a long process when their children are in preschool. So they are 4 years old. They have to sign their children up to take the tests. The parents that have the resources pay for test prep. And
For their 4-year-olds.
4-year-olds, they get their children prepped and pay thousands of dollars on tutoring. Private preschools, when I did my study in 2008, some private preschools were also prepping students for the G&T tests. And then we have districts like District 3, where hundreds of students are getting 99s on the G&T test.
It's Lake Wobegon. Everybody's
Yes.
above average.
Right. They set this arbitrary cutoff at the 90th percentile, and we see how segregated it is citywide. So really the G&T policy that is based on parents as the gatekeepers and standardized tests that we know reflect socioeconomic status. We should not be surprised with who's getting in. And this, and in my research, I did find that Black and Latino lower income parents are testing their children for gifted and talented programs, but they're not making that arbitrary cutoff because of the prepping, I think. And they're not prepping, the parents that I spoke to. They didn't believe in prepping. They didn't have, even if they said they had the money to prep, they would not choose to do that. And the other thing that happens is that the white parents that I spoke to, they don't stop at kindergarten if their child doesn't get in. So they'll prep and retest until they eventually get in first or second grade. So it's this cycle, and that's it.
And the African American parents will not retest and begin to wonder whether they want their child to be the only
Right.
Black child in the all-white classroom.
Right.
Anyway. In terms of solutions, Maya, what happened in District 22 in Ditmas Park
She's going to
when
make
your
me tell the
children...
personal story. Thanks, Clara. It's what happens when you work with people. They know too much. But this actually, but I want to appreciate my school, where the neighborhood elementary school my kids went to, where very, very few of my white neighbors sent their children at the time, although it was 25% of the neighborhood was white. I think about 5% of the school was. But very, very diverse school, high free and reduced lunch percentage, and my kids went there. And one of the things that kids did with my younger daughter, when she was there, they had actually decided to do an in-school gifted program as opposed to a district-wide gifted program. And as an in-school program, then what they did is they just assessed every single kindergartner. They didn't ask the parents to assess them. They didn't tell us they were assessing them. They were in-school, in-classroom assessments. They weren't like some big, massive sit-down formal test. And then every single child that got in the top 10% of the classroom, the family got an invitation to the gifted program. Now, again, the school was not, it was a heavily student of color school, Black, Latino, and South Asian. So the gifted programs typically looked very diverse anyway. But the point was that the principle was you didn't have to ask, and that the mode was assessment. And then everyone was invited who were simply got the top 10% band. And I think that's just an important way that we start to think about it.
Are you aware of any joint housing and educational policies to address school diversity? Maya, I think this one's for you too.
Okay, yes, now we're putting on my professional hat. So, one thing that is critically important to note is that, as I said earlier, this is a national phenomenon, not a New York City phenomenon, that schools are resegregating. We're actually doubled the rate of school segregation and concentrated poverty. We've doubled it for, since 2000 to 2014 for schools that are 90% low income and Black and Latino, doubled it. There are many, many reasons for that, like the 200 court desegregation orders that were overseeing schools that have been lifted in the country since 1991. But it's also the case that housing has always been segregated in this country, but we're resegregating it through affordability as well as discrimination. And I think we have both, and we have to confront that as a city. But what that's meant is that where places have used strategies like protecting or creating more affordable housing in communities that were diversifying, that includes, by the way, not just diversifying communities that are low income, not just in the gentrification scenario, but where you have predominantly white, high opportunity neighborhoods actually targeting housing subsidy dollars and public housing and other kinds of programs so that you're actually creating more opportunity for people of color to live in those neighborhoods. There have been lawsuits like in Baltimore around this and other places, but the reason it's important, and I think it's one of the things we have been hearing actively in our town halls and from parents and communities, is we do have to think about the relationship between housing and schools, not just think about schools and what DOE can do, and that's why we have to think about our long-term strategies. But it really fundamentally becomes aligning and de-siloing city decisions around how the city is investing and planning. And one of the wonderful things that's happening right now under Commissioner Maria Torres Springer is looking at how housing and what HPD is doing can help support more vibrant and diverse communities. And so finding ways to support the Department of Education being part of that with HPD and city planning is another thing we have to think about and look at.
HPD being the Department of
Housing Preservation and Development,
Yes.
sorry.
The government nudges people to make choices that benefit the public good in lots of ways. Think recycling, healthcare, et cetera. What could government do to incentivize choices that benefit public schools or de-incentivize opt-out of zone schools? 15 seconds, anybody?
That's a PhD dissertation.
Okay.
Nicole, second.
We'll move on to the next. What are the available policy solutions besides set-asides which do nothing for under-resourced schools serving isolated Black and brown students? Maya, you talked a little bit about that.
I did.
So,
Can you repeat the question?
so
I'm not sure I was following.
what are the policy solutions? Set-asides are a method by which if a school is becoming very popular with the
Right.
upper middle class,
Yeah.
that you set aside a certain number of
percentage of
seats
seats, yes.
for low-income families. What are the policy solutions that we can use that are not the set-asides, which only work if you have a
Right, you have
yeah,
one of the things, again, one of the things that some of the research shows and what also parents themselves are raising and students themselves are raising is how do you invest in the schools? Whether it's magnet programs, which have been effective in the past, where you're creating and resourcing schools to be attractive because of the investments in the programs that are happening within the building. One example, by the way, which I think is a really important one to think about for New York City is, learning a second language. The effective way of learning that is immersion. The effective way of having an immersive experience is to be in diverse schools where you have folks for whom that language is their first language, that is not English, and seeing that as a resource and as an opportunity. And of course, English language is one of the ways in which students are segregated in this city, but it's also an incredible opportunity for all of us to think about how we create some of the capacities that's fundamentally necessary for our kids growing up in a global society. And the trick then becomes, how do we make it stable? And at a certain point, this is where we look at multiple policy solutions over time. Again, it's not just not one size fits all for a particular neighborhood. It's not one size fits all like we made this decision once and we're just sticking with this decision and we're never changing it. Because a neighborhood school in my neighborhood in Washington, D.C., which at the time was an immersion Spanish program that no one white sent their kids to when I was growing up, is now almost all white, and their struggle is to get more Latino students in the schools, and that's because of housing patterns and housing affordability. So at a certain point, even with a successful policy, we have to pull some of those other policy solutions over time and see it as a trajectory of policy innovation and over time as schools change, and not think there's just a single snapshot scenario.
And
Here's
just-
another one
could I
from
just
Maya. Oh,
piggyback
go ahead,
on
Ruth.
what Maya's saying about dual language programs. They are so important to invest in, but we also have to think about who we're prioritizing in them. In District 3, for example, the English-speaking population is almost entirely white, right? Black and Latino parents who apply to the program whose children are English-speaking are denied access. And also then, there's a particular kind of curating of which immigrants are desirable for those programs, right? So it's turning,
Absolutely.
it's creating the inverse of what those programs were originally designed to do and what they could do.
Yes.
Right.
Thank you for that.
Here's one for Maya, it's kind of cranky. Rather than, and I didn't write it, I promise. Rather than create new recommendations, when will the city work on and promote the resources, provide resources to the recommendations made by the Center for New York City Affairs and the Chancellor's report from last year?
Well, so first of all, I don't think that's a cranky question. I think that's a legitimate question. And one of the things that we've been doing as a working group, again, first of all, we've created a data resource for ourselves, for everyone in the working group has access to, where we're taking all the reports and recommendations that have been developed, as well as research on what works, some of which has been tried elsewhere, not in New York City. And we have that as our resource repository. So it is one of the things that we're looking at to craft recommendations. What I will not sit here today and say is what those recommendations will be, because I'm simply one member of a team of people who are having active discussions with one another as well as with the public about what those recommendations should be. So for us, what's important is to collect those. It is why we want to hear from folks. We have collected the reports and recommendations from New York City Affairs, by the way, but also we recognize there may be some things we're missing. And if there are, please send them to us. And I did pull up because I want to make sure everyone knows. This can also be comments and ideas. It doesn't have to be only based on actual reports, but it's diversity@schools.nyc.gov, and we absolutely want to hear recommendations that have already been developed.
I'm going to let Uju go because she has a meeting with her dean, who's the only person more important than us right at this moment. But I'm going to ask the remaining panelists, are you optimistic or are you pessimistic? Chancellor Rosa. The prospects for...
I'm very optimistic about the process of...
Prospects for more school integration.
I think I'm not optimistic or pessimistic. I think I'm realistic.
All right, that's enough. We're going to go on next one.
Well, I've been given the short. Make sure you keep it short. So I will continue to keep it short. So I'm realistic. Thank you.
Maya.
I am a possibilist. This is completely possible, and it's up to us.
I'm generally an optimistic person. I believe that the world is a good place. I think despite the news that we see and what we hear, and I think people love each other, or they have someone that they love, and that love permeates to everything that we touch and see and believe. And I think optimistically, I think that we can reach that as long as it's a shared goal.
I'm also an optimist, and I think without hope for a more equitable school system and future for our children, we will just stay stagnant and do minimal change. So I am very optimistic, and I, with my work, really try to highlight the positive stories and efforts made by parents in the school system.
Well, I'm glad we've got at least a couple of optimists. I want to thank the New York Community Trust and Deutsche Bank America's Foundation, which has provided support for this program and for our research. This is the third year of our integration project at the Center for New York City Affairs at the New School, and we have many of our reports are online at the Center NYC website. I want to really thank you all for coming, and thank you for your interest.
Can I just announce where our next two town halls are so that you
Yes.
can get the word out and hopefully come? So May 15th, Staten Island, the CSI High School for International Studies. And Thursday, June 21st, in Manhattan, the Frederick Douglass Academy. It's on the website. I'm just naming the schools, so please go to the schools.nyc.gov .gov website, and Sadie Campamore, who's here from DOE, who's been a phenomenal leader. Thank you for helping to pull all this community engagement together.